with Physicians for Social Responsibility and a longtime member of the EJAC, and I wore red in commemoration of the very first vote on the scoping plan because I was wearing red then, and I was here then, as were many community members, and I want to thank all the folks who came out. I want to thank my fellow Environmental Justice Advisory Committee members for the tremendous amount of work that we've done to get ready for you today. We will be presenting a series of recommendations on the scoping plan sector by sector. We're going to talk about, of course, carbon removal technologies that underpin an already weak scoping plan. And then Jill will come up and talk about Indigenous and tribal issues. And then we're, in your package, we're actually presenting the better path. Because in the words of Angela Johnson-Nazaros, during the first scoping plan, there is a better way. And I think the environmental justice community and the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee has been hard at work trying to figure out how to work with CARB and all the other agencies to figure out what is a better path that gets us to clean air. We live in communities where carbon is the co-pollutant. No facility just emits carbon. We live in communities where there's an extractive economy. And we see how that extractive or incumbent economy has been privileged in this scoping plan. And we think we could do better and more collectively as CARB, but as a state to get on that path for a just transition where workers and communities are first. So we're deep, oh, the slideshow, next slide. I keep forgetting to do that. Next slide. We want to adopt a real zero alternative. Net zero, these net neutrality goals often hide false solutions or climate dead ends that continue to rely on the fossil fuel industry, and we need to do better and go further. This plan will not meet those 2030 goals or even our 2045 goals with this net greenhouse gas emissions. The real path for zero, sorry, I'm trying to read notes and look at the path. Next slide. And the next slide will be my partner in crime here, Sharifa. But we are urging CARB to put California on a path to a full coordinated phase out of fossil fuels with a just transition. Without doing this, our communities who continue to live next to oil drilling sites, refineries, cement plants, our communities from California, throughout California, from where I live in Los Angeles to Wilmington to the Central Valley. That is where we need to focus our efforts on cleaning the air. Remember that carbon is the co-pollutant where we live and breathe. It's lung level pollution. And so our measures have to focus on direct emissions reductions as we figure out the plan for a just transition. So with that, I'm handing it over to Sharifa for you. And let me explain some of the process. We'll be going back between Sharifa and myself, Dr. Catherine Garupa-White, who is on the phone right now, and then we will have a speaker who is an expert on pipeline safety to present, and then Jill will present. Thanks. That works.
The draft plan has no plan to phase out of the fossil fuel production that is driving the climate crisis. In the refinery sector, the draft relies on a steep demand side reduction while ignoring the fact that oil exports from refineries have been increasing. Without a commitment to a plan to manage the decline of refineries in California by 2045, there is no way to meet the state's GHG reduction goals statewide or public health and safety goals in refinery communities. There's also no way for workers and communities to plan for a just and equitable transition. Next slide, please. Instead of a real plan to phase out fossil fuel refining, the proposed scenario includes the most extensive, immediate, and heavy reliance on carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, in refineries, which are the state's largest industrial emitters. This is a dangerous, expensive, and unrealistic proposal to sacrifice low-income communities of color. And moving back the timeline to implement CCS in California refineries is not a solution. CARB should only use modeling assumptions that are supported by operational data, cost, and deployment timelines. If it does, we know that CCS cannot be used as a GHG reduction strategy in the refinery sector. Next slide, please. This is the slide that started it all. CCS expansion at California refineries is dangerous and technically unfeasible because there isn't enough space. So this image is from a Google Earth show, which demonstrates part of the Marathon LA refinery. It shows that refineries are much more complex and dense than small industries. And if you even just visually look at it now, you can tell that there's barely any space just for the vehicles to maneuver around the plant. There are hundreds of massive heaters and boilers and miles of piping between. Next slide, please. Thank you. The draft scoping plan's proposed targets for oil and gas extractions are internally inconsistent. The draft scoping plan quotes that while the summary table in the draft says oil and gas extraction phase out operations by 2045, the draft seems to weaken this commitment. This is from page 59, table 2-2, actions for the proposed scenario. AB 32 GHG inventory sectors. But we need clarity and certainty from CARB. This draft also says, to avoid leakage as called for in AB 32 and meet that remaining demand for petroleum fuel, a complete phase out of oil and gas extraction and refining is not possible by 2045. The draft scoping plan assumes the following. 1, a phase down in oil and gas extraction by 2045 and refining in line with the reduction in demand for in-state on-road petroleum fuel demand. And 2, GHG emissions from oil and gas extraction could be reduced approximately 85% in 2045 from 2020 levels if extraction decreases in line with in-state finished fuel demand. This quote is from page 78. Next slide, please. CARB must modify the plan to include an action to phase out oil and gas extraction in-state by 2035. In-state oil extraction provides about a third of crude oil used in California refineries. Oil extraction emits substantial GHGs, including methane, smog precursors, and toxic emissions heavily concentrated in EJAC communities. This is consistent with local municipal plans, such as the County of Los Angeles declaring oil extraction to be incompatible land use this past year. Additionally, we want to flag that the draft also opens the door to enhanced oil recovery, EOR, more extractions, and GHGs, which CCS can be used for. Next slide, please.
Hi, good morning. This is Dr. Catherine Garupa-White with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition and the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. I'll mainly be off camera for connectivity issues, but wanted to briefly say hi and appreciate that I'm able to join and give comments virtually today. Thank you for the opportunity to provide feedback on the draft scoping plan. Thank you to community members waiting so patiently to comment on such an important issue. Thank you to my fellow EJAC co-chairs and colleagues who have put in so much work despite so many constraints, including the ongoing pandemic. It's an honor to co-present today and to recently have been elected as co-chair to replace my colleague Paulina with Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. The recommendations before you today represent countless hours invested by EJAC and partners to build consensus on positions on a wide range of complex issues and to respond to the analysis from the Air Resources Board, which has been a time-intensive investment yet essential to our movement building process, and really appreciate how much effort my colleagues have put in, along with the many unpaid technical experts who have contributed. What I'm going to cover today on carbon dioxide removal, cap and trade, and livestock methane is very high level and by no means comprehensive. There are ample opportunities to discuss offline, details provided in additional comment letters, and we look forward to other ongoing efforts to consult and, where possible, collaborate. Relying on such a large amount of carbon dioxide removal is an inherently risky and uncertain strategy that comes at a huge opportunity cost versus the benefits that we could gain if we focused on equitable investments in renewable energy and ecological restoration. Next slide, please. In addition, ramping up direct air capture would require additional energy capacity that the state currently doesn't have, which would either have to come from fossil fuels or renewables. Any increased capacity in energy generation should directly power California's communities and the economy, not direct air capture machines. Next slide, please. The draft scoping plan says, quote, carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS for short, will be a necessary tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate climate change while minimizing leakage. In response, the EJAC has pointed out that point source carbon capture, use, and storage is not a negative emissions technology, and in fact, in many cases, releases more carbon into the atmosphere than it removes. As currently practiced, CCUS is net additive, releasing into the atmosphere more carbon dioxide than it removes. There is an energy penalty when new natural gas power plants have to come online to power CCUS projects, and that produces other harmful environmental impacts. Refineries have multiple point sources and fugitive process emissions as just one example. It's difficult to capture all point source and process emissions, resulting in significant reduction in the actual capture rates of these projects. And as just one example, the Shell Quest CCS project in Canada, which was the model used by CARB staff in developing the original 2018 low carbon fuel standard CCS protocol, boasted of tackling global warming, claiming that it demonstrates that carbon capture systems are quote unquote safe and effective. However, recent research shows that Quest is in fact emitting more than it's capturing. Despite having captured 5 million metric tons of carbon across a 5-year period, the project has emitted a further 7.5 million tons of climate polluting gases during the same time. Each year, Shell's plant has the same carbon footprint as approximately 1.2 million gas-powered vehicles. Just 48% of the plant's carbon emissions are captured, woefully short of the 90% carbon capture rate promised by industry. This rate drops to only 39% when including other greenhouse gas emissions from Shell's project. Next slide, please. So again, again, a comparative analysis here where the draft scoping plan claims that California's deep sedimentary rock formations, particularly in the Central Valley, represent world-class CO2 storage sites that would meet the highest standards with storage capacities of at least 17 billion tons of CO2. However, the Air Resources Board is targeting the Central Valley with CO2 injection wells and pipelines, and researchers have publicly stated that part of why the Central Valley appears to be a good place for storage is because of existing oil drilling and the information that's been obtained by the oil industry in order to do that drilling, despite a long history of failures, including injecting oil wastewater into underground aquifers. Most CCUS projects in California are currently slated for the Central and specifically the San Joaquin Valley, which is the state's historically most polluted region, and a region which the state is again assuming will continue to bear the cost of the state's deferral of real climate action. Next slide, please. There's ample evidence that carbon capture could lead to significant environmental, health, and safety hazards. And again, the proposed projects are in some of our most overburdened environmental justice communities. If mitigating climate change is the goal, we have to take impacts on factors such as water, increases in solid waste that also directly affect the climate. In addition, the draft scoping plan claims that the Central Valley has an ideal geologic substrate for CO2 sequestration, but since the substrate already has many fractures and fissures, the threat of CO2 leakage increases. So this image on the slide is a map of Bakersfield There's so much extractive infrastructure in the Central Valley with tens of thousands of wells, including numerous that are idle and abandoned. It is no longer geologically sound for injecting CO2 underground. Black dots on the map represent all of the existing and inactive oil and gas extraction wells. All of these straws poked into the ground are hazards for CO2 leakage that could create carbonic acid in groundwater. The red triangle on the map is one of Chevron's proposed CCS injection / geologic storage sites. This is particularly important as Bakersfield is not only densely populated, but because of existing oil and gas operations, it is an already immensely overburdened environmental justice community. Some of you may have heard the story of Satartia, Mississippi, where in 2020, a whole town was hit by an invisible and acutely hazardous levels of CO2 gas from a pipeline rupture. The CO2 pipeline failure resulted in local evacuations and caused almost 50 people to seek medical attention. The impacts of this pipeline failure had a disparate racial impact as all of the victims of CO2 poisoning in Satartia were African American. Even aside from the corrosion caused by CO2, pipelines also leak. With current pipelines in Kern County, there have already been multiple methane leaks. Methane is a high potency greenhouse gas. To speak more on this issue, I want to introduce Bill Karam, Executive Director of the Pipeline Safety Trust, to provide a brief overview of these risks. And then I'll have some concluding comments before moving on to the next topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Chair Randolph, members of the board, CARB staff, and the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts today. My name is Bill Karam. I'm the Executive Director of the Pipeline Safety Trust. We formed in the aftermath of a 1999 pipeline tragedy in Bellingham, Washington that stole the lives of 3 boys. And we work to prevent other families and communities from having to experience the needless grief as those in Bellingham. Since our founding, we have served as the only national public advocacy organization dedicated to pipeline safety. As an organization, we have testified before U.S. Congress dozens of times on many pipeline-related topics. I was appointed to the U.S. Department of Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg to serve on the Federal Hazardous Liquids Pipeline Advisory Committee, and I was appointed by Washington's Governor Inslee to serve on the Citizens Committee on Pipeline Safety. Our previous executive director was named by President Obama as a champion of change for his work for the Pipeline Safety Trust. And I'm here today to speak about carbon dioxide pipelines. Virtually any plan that includes carbon capture and sequestration or direct air capture will involve transporting that captured CO2 via pipeline. And as Catherine mentioned, residents of Satartia, Mississippi learned the hard way that they have a CO2 pipeline in their community. When that pipeline ruptured in 2020, the escaped CO2 caused a harrowing experience for many, sending more than 45 people to the hospital with symptoms of asphyxiation. And some are still recovering from that night, now 2 years later. In response to that event, along with the sudden increase of proposed CO2 pipelines in connection to various carbon capture and sequestration projects, the Pipeline Safety Trust commissioned a report from an independent pipeline safety engineer to identify the safety risks and regulatory gaps posed by CO2 pipelines. The report, which was released in March and can be found on our website, outlined the history of CO2 pipelines and identified a number of unique safety risks posed by those pipelines, along with corresponding regulatory gaps. Congress first asked the Federal Pipeline Safety Agency, PHMSA, to regulate CO2 pipelines in 1988 after a natural gas release of CO2 from Lake Nyos in Cameroon killed every oxygen-breathing being within 18 miles, including 1,700 people. PHMSA responded to that mandate by tagging on "End CO2" to highly volatile liquids regulations, despite the unique properties and risks of these pipelines. CO2 pipelines are operated at very high pressure, and releases lead to rapid, often violent phase changes. Because CO2 is an asphyxiant and heavier than air, it can stay close to the ground after a release and move long distances, often many miles. Traditional methods of determining potential impact areas around hydrocarbon pipelines are inappropriate and insufficient for CO2 lines, but that is exactly what the regulations call for. Denbury, the pipeline operator in Satarsha, Mississippi, identified the area around its pipeline that could be impacted by a failure, and many of the people hospitalized were outside of that identified area. Our report also found that CO2 is entirely unregulated if it is transported as a gas or as a liquid. It is only regulated if it is transported as a supercritical fluid. There are no standards as to levels of various contaminants, some of which are very common, corrosive, and or toxic. CO2 acts very differently from hydrocarbons in the pipeline and after a rupture, and the regulations are simply not up to the task of keeping communities safe. I would also like to point out that the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council last year listed both CCS and direct air capture as projects that would not benefit a community. A study published just last month by Environmental Science and Technology, based on data from EDF and Colorado State University, show the disproportionate burden of pipeline dangers our most vulnerable communities bear. The study found that natural gas pipeline leaks are more prevalent in neighborhoods whose populations are predominantly low income or people of color. And there have been several similar studies with, sadly, similar conclusions. I encourage you all to read our report and pay special attention to our summary of findings and regulatory recommendations. I encourage you to click on the link on our page website of the test rupture of a CO2 pipeline, so you can get a sense of a supercritical fluid failure's violent rupture. I encourage you to read Dan Ziegart's harrowing article about the CO2 pipeline in Satarsha, Mississippi, to start to understand the risks these pipelines will pose to our communities. And I ask you to look at ways to close these regulatory gaps before any of California's communities are asked to shoulder the burden of risk these pipelines pose. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill, for that presentation. So again, just a high-level overview, not a comprehensive assessment of all of the issues and concerns. So a couple of things before we, I see if the other co-chairs have anything they want to add, and then we segue to the next topic. But thank you, Bill, again for that presentation. And at least personally, I was validated at the last Environmental Justice Advisory Committee meeting in hearing CARB staff make a commitment to revisit and adjust the CDR assumptions based on some of the challenges and questions that environmental justice advocates have raised with decision makers. The Environmental Justice Advisory Committee last month hosted a webinar specifically to elevate proposed projects and community concerns related to carbon capture, use, and storage projects. That recording is available and posted on CARB's EJAC resources website. This will also be a major topic of discussion at our EJAC meeting on Monday and Tuesday for those who are interested and available to participate. And many of our organizations are involved in organizing at the administrative and regulatory levels and legislative levels as well beyond the scoping plan, because we know that this is just one slice of the issue. Martha, Dean, or Sharifa, did you want to add anything before we move on to cap and trade?
Yes, I do want to share a really positive thing. Cities are where things are happening that are incredibly important. Cities are the places where we're building backstops to bad policies. So, I want to report that on June 9th, the City of New Orleans Council passed unanimously a resolution prohibiting the underground storage of carbon dioxide facilities for this purpose. No one knows better than Louisiana and New Orleans what it means to live in Chemical Alley, what it means to live with the refineries, and what it would mean to extend the life of those facilities for another 150 years. So I want to show an example of cities that are built on oil that are being bold. And with that, Sharifa?
Nothing for me. Go ahead, Dr. Catherine.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So specifically on the role of the cap and trade program, I'm one of the conveners of the cap and trade work group. And yesterday we submitted a letter with additional details. So again, a high level summary here that I would point you to that letter, or definitely open to questions and further conversations. Many organizations and environmental justice advisory committee representatives have been engaged for many years in discussions around the cap and trade program, the associated rulemaking, and again, legislative and other related efforts outside of the scoping plan process itself. The scoping plan presents a timely opportunity to evaluate the role of the cap and trade program in our overall climate program, and to explore potential changes to the program to ensure that climate justice is also realized. First and foremost, the Air Resources Board must prioritize direct emission reduction measures in the scoping plan. Cap and trade is not a direct emission reduction measure. It is a market-based mechanism as defined in and authorized by statute. Legislation requiring the prioritization of direct emissions measures should be reflected in the distribution of measures identified in the scenario that's adopted to reach 2030 and subsequent carbon neutral goals and targets. Direct emission reduction measures include, but are not limited to, the following ideas suggested by EJAC: stronger vehicle standards, accelerated clean energy targets under the renewable portfolio standard, a managed decline off fossil fuel extraction and production, reduction in pesticide use, and investment in whole home retrofits that would decrease fossil fuel and electricity demand over time. Secondly, CARB should reduce the percentage of reductions expected from the cap and trade program. There is no evidence that cap and trade is driving emission reductions, particularly given the persistently high emissions in some covered sectors and the existence of more direct measures that are much more likely to drive reductions. Furthermore, the carbon market is unpredictable and the need for accelerated emission reductions to meet our 2030 climate targets is real. Third, CARB should strengthen data reporting to ensure timely tracking of emissions changes. Improved data collection and transparency would better inform decision-making and rulemaking processes as we strive to reach our ambitious climate targets while addressing public health concerns through improving air quality. CARB, as the agency in charge of our state implementation plans, cannot afford to keep taking a siloed approach to data collection and interventions that could reduce both greenhouse gases and co-pollutants. Specifically, in the next cap and trade rulemaking, CARB should require annual progress updates from covered entities, and that data should be integrated into CARB's pollution mapping tool for public review and to allow visualization on a facility and company-specific scale. Finally, the Air Resources Board should make scenario assumptions that include key changes to the program to provide greater certainty that cap and trade will deliver the needed reductions without deepening environmental injustices. These include, number one, eliminating free allowances, number two, eliminating offsets, number three, restricting trading in disadvantaged communities, continuing to accept allowances in lieu of emissions reductions, particularly in communities out of compliance with decades-old clean air standards and or high levels of exposure to toxics should be out of the question. Facilities in and directly adjacent to disadvantaged communities, facilities located in communities that are out of compliance with clean air standards, and other overburdened communities should not be allowed Facilities there should not be allowed to trade allowances or use offset credits, and should instead be required to demonstrate facility level reductions on par with the declining cap. This would protect the most impacted communities from co-pollutants, and we vigorously reject the notion that AB 617, the Community Air Protection Program, alone can deliver the needed reductions. The program has not proven after 5 years through implementation to generate significant reductions, and cannot serve as a substitute for coordinated state protections for communities overburdened by air pollution. Finally, if earlier recommendations are not adopted, we urge the Air Resources Board to consider and adopt the recommendations of the Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee related to offset availability, raising the allowance price floor, and reducing the supply of new allowances to keep the system as stringent as possible. I appreciate that Martha Dina Arguello and I were invited to participate in last month's IEMAC meeting. And while we may not be in agreement about the overall role of the cap and trade program, generally we are in alignment on the need for robust analysis and program adjustments. Next slide, please. The last topic I'll be covering today is livestock methane. Overall, CARB must include direct regulation of livestock methane as a critical strategy for achieving necessary methane reductions. Digesters do not address enteric emissions, and accumulation of manure creates significant air and water pollution. Under the proposed scenario, California will not achieve the minimum methane reduction requirements set forth in SB 1383, which is a 40% reduction below 2013 levels by 2030. CARB is currently modeling in the proposed scenario a decline in the state's aggregate herd size, even though the Air Resources Board's own policies incentivize increased herd sizes through lucrative dairy digester and low carbon fuel standard subsidies, and the Air Resources Board is proposing to scale these up in the proposed scenario. The draft scoping plan recommends building an additional 380 costly dairy digesters by 2030. However, dairy biomethane has a similar environmental impact as fossil fuels when burned, and dairy digesters significantly exacerbate local air and water pollution. Rather than reducing methane emissions at the source, dairy digesters only capture and commodify livestock methane from manure, perversely incentivizing the creation of methane. Not only do they favor manure production, but they do nothing to address methane from enteric emissions. CARB will have the legal authority to directly regulate livestock methane starting in 2024, yet this option is persistently absent from CARB's discussion on methane and is absent from the draft scoping plan and the modeling. In the revised scoping plan, CARB must include direct regulation of livestock methane. The focus in the scoping plan must be on setting regulatory caps on the amount of methane that farms in the industry as a whole are allowed to emit. Although regulated emissions reductions are a standard for other highly emitting sectors, direct reductions are currently absent for the livestock methane sector in the proposed scenario. But CARB must prioritize direct emissions reductions per AB 197. If the state hopes to attain its short-lived climate pollutant targets set forth in SB 1383 and beyond, CARB must include a strategy to directly regulate livestock methane starting in 2024 and include it as a recommended strategy in the scoping plan. As this is the last section and last slide I'll be presenting, I wanted to close by saying that overall, I think what you'll hear consistently throughout the day is what the EJAC has been saying from the beginning, that we need to say no to false solutions like over-relying on cap and trade, dairy digesters, and carbon dioxide removal, and instead of expecting our environmental justice communities to be resilient, we should be changing the root causes that have created these circumstances: racism, patriarchy, and settler colonialism. How we achieve our climate goals matters as much as when we achieve them, and we need a plan for real zero, not net zero. Thank you again for the opportunity to comment, and I will pass it back to Martha Dina.
Sorry. It's like I'm on Zoom and muted. Sharifa will be doing the transportation piece, and she'll pass it to me to do building decarbonization. Thanks.
All right, next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. 40% of emissions are from transportation, and investing in affordable, accessible mass transit is key to achieving our climate goals. Reducing vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, and an overall more equitable transportation system. At a minimum, 11% of all trips should be made on transit by 2035. That would equate to about a 30% VMT reduction. Equally critical is the rapid adoption of zero-emission heavy-duty trucks. EJ communities need clean trucks as soon as possible. Reports show that 2035 is a feasible timeline for 100% ZEV sales for trucks, and drayage trucks at ports can be all ZEV by 2030. Next slide, please. We wanted to include this slide here about transit justice for California's most transit-dependent residents, because when we think about public transit, a lot of times it's seen as an alternative to driving our personal vehicles, which that in and of itself is a privilege. But for folks who have disabilities, whether that's being blind or in a wheelchair or some other type of physical or mental disability, they're reliant upon public transit and services just like paratransit, which paratransit is reliant upon bus routes. And so when bus service decreases, it makes it so that people who may not be able to walk or roll themselves to a transit stop are unable to get reliable access to the services they need via paratransit. So that's why transportation justice and massifying public transit in California is so important. And so we ask that you work with the transportation agencies in the state in order to help us achieve that goal. Next slide, please. Here, we just wanted to speak a bit about the electric vehicle infrastructure. So from the draft scoping plan, there's a quote on page 150 which says, private investment in reliable, affordable, and ubiquitous refueling infrastructure may drive the transition as the business case for ZEVs continues to strengthen, and so in our EJAC recommendation, in F6, CARB must increase accessibility to low-income communities and communities of color to EV charging infrastructure in key locations that are frequently used. Essentially, the scoping plan draft is leaving it up to the market to ensure that EV charging stations are equitably sited in EJ communities, leaving them to be second-class citizens when it comes to EV access. Next slide, please. 16% of transit ridership has increased since September 2021 from the launch of the San Diego MTS Pronto Transit Fare card paired with free transit. There's also been success stories with Green Raiteros in Huron, which is a zero-emission transportation ride for rural community residents, where these residents are able to get wherever they need to go using a zero-emission vehicle. Additionally, the Port of San Diego had a goal for 100% ZEV trucks by 2030, and this is something that was documented in the 2021 Maritime Clean Air Strategy, also known as MCAS. In May 2022, Youth Opportunity Pass pilot program was launched in San Diego County for all youth 18 and under, where those youth will be able to ride transit for free. And since May, there has been a 77% increase in new unique youth transit riders. So these are just a few success stories where we've been able to increase ridership in ZEVs as well as with public transit. Next slide, please.
Great, thank you. You're going to be able to see my slides, and in the interest of time, I just want to give some high-level issues around the issue of building decarbonization, which is actually one of the examples where we have actually been able to work with CARB, the team that's working on building decarb, simultaneously as we are part of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. And the issue of the decarbonization of buildings from where we sit at the community level sort of came at us as a policy that was already decided. Somebody decided, announced it, and then those of us who work with affordable housing, low-income housing, unhoused communities were really concerned with how these policies would impact low-income housing and residents. And so many of us came together, created a coalition, which is the Building Equity and Power Coalition, which is BEEP, and have been able to work with CARB in an example of what co-design can begin to look like, and what it looks like beyond the life of the EJAC when we begin to actually implement and roll out the policies. And so I think that has been for us a bright spot, because we've been here I've been doing this for 22 years with CARB and all the boards and departments in one way or another. And so this feels different in the sense of getting listened to. Yes, we have to get loud, but who doesn't like to get loud? That said, the louder we get, the more listening, and I think we do need more resources to support community engagement. Just last week, we had a community engagement workshop with over 150 folks participating, and this is one of the hottest topics. I think people are really interested in it, and we want to make sure that we get the multiple benefits of decarbonizing buildings, improving air quality, particularly in low-income communities. We want to make sure that the burdens of implementing those programs do not fall on low and middle-income people, and make sure that we figure out enough resources so there's no those upfront costs and many of the problems that we saw with the solar program, that we don't recreate those problems. So I think this model of working deeply with communities and impacted folks and workers and others will allow us to have multiple benefits, both the job creation benefits, lower energy costs, and getting rid of fossil fuels within our housing infrastructure, both at homes, public buildings, and other buildings. I'm still very torn about what to do about restaurants, I'm not gonna lie. But I think part of what we're trying to do is figure out what those are. What are those trade-offs, right? When we're at the table deciding those, we feel different about them. Communities feel different about them. And there's a whole psychological research around locus of control. And having that locus of control is often health protective. And we found that with workers. And that's what we're trying to tell you, right? Informed prior consent is key, whether you're talking about CCS or you're talking about building decarbonization. Having the most impact at the table to help inform your decisions means you'll do better policy. And it allows you to see the spectrum of challenges, right? You can move through the slides because I'm not even following them, but the data's on there in terms of our recommendations. Next slide. And again, back a little bit. What we're trying to do with buildings and having really meeting these aggressive goals and building in aggressive protections for low-income communities, which is what we're doing at the city level with Los Angeles, is building up those through the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, through our Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, through a very deliberative process. We are ensuring that we get to the real zero and not overburdening low and middle income folks, and actually creating jobs, because we've had a table that was set with labor, with environmental justice, with health folks, and builders and others, and we're building that, and we want to bring that model to you at CARB. Next slide. Because we want, next slide. Did this already. This is incredibly important, a really important part, and I think what you can do is in your role as convener is actually create a space that's non-confrontational, that has not happened before, where environmental justice communities and workers can come together to figure out what the transition looks like, versus the fossil fuel industry who's pushing solutions that basically say, we're gonna say we're doing something, but what we're actually doing is delaying action. And we've seen what that's gotten us. I mentioned I've been at this for 22 years, and there's folks that have been at it for longer. Delaying action doesn't make the problem better. That's something, you know, the healthcare industry certainly knows. So we want to make sure that we have job training for contractors, job access for underrepresented local and priority populations. Where I work in South LA, you know, the foster youth program is leading to people get, you know, the prison to school pipeline, the school to prison pipeline. I wish it were the other way. What's happening is those folks come out and they can't get jobs, right? Because there's a box on the job application. So that's driving incredibly high unemployment rates. We need to design programs that, with them in mind, that have them being part of solving the problems that exist in their communities, like air pollution. So we want to be able to have project labor and community workforce agreements, support job placement pathways, because we've got to support our brothers and sisters in the labor movement through a just transition. And actually stop talking about, you know, it's not solar jobs, there's not a one-to-one comparison. And we need to do it together because it's not going to be easy, and we need to support them in that transition so that the jobs that they go into are comparable, living, thriving wages, right? We can talk about survival wages, or we can talk about thriving wages, and they're very different things. Next slide. So we, again, there are some embedded tensions within the plan. Where will this new energy come from? So they will be using combustion directly, and so we have to be mindful of making sure that those energy sources are clean and not making us stay on this fossil fuel wheel. And next slide. Am I doing this one?
No, it's me. So yeah, this section is about electricity. We know that electrification is one of the major ways we're gonna transition away from some of the more harmful industries. Sorry about that. Okay, perfect. So the scoping plan includes large quantities of electrification across multiple sectors, which means significant growth in electricity demand, projected at 80% growth by 2045. But as this electricity demand grows, it is critical that the electric sector also get cleaner in order to avoid intensifying GHG emissions and toxic pollution from gas plants. If we don't set strong electric sector emission targets, this trend will effectively shift pollution from other sectors such as transportation and buildings to fence line communities that border gas plants. Electrification in other sectors must be matched by electric sector decarbonization to comply with SB 100 and to avoid intensifying pollution in EJAC communities. Next slide, please. The greenhouse gas emissions limit set by the scoping plan determines the emission limits that the CPUC uses in the integrated resource plan proceeding. This emission limit has a direct impact on which resources the utilities and community choice aggregators purchase. But the draft scoping plan sets a GHG limit, why does it be flies here? Sets a GHG limit of 30 million metric tons in 2045, not the zero carbon grid required by SB 100. That law requires that eligible renewable energy resources and zero carbon resources supply 100% of all retail sales of electricity by December 31st, 2045. The scoping plan proposes that the electric sector never reaches zero emissions because CARB does not count transmission line losses. However, SB 100 requires 100% of electricity to be carbon-free. The draft scoping plan would only have about 80% of our electricity as carbon-free based on the reasoning that line losses shouldn't be counted in the retail sales definition of SB 100. This isn't a fair accounting of electricity emissions. Consumers pay for line losses in their retail rates. For every customer, a utility procures additional electricity to account for what is lost in delivery over inefficient long-distance transmission lines. If we are truly to decarbonize electricity generation, we need to make sure that the actual emissions target reaches zero and that transmission line losses are incorporated into the retail sales definition. Even further, transmission line losses are irrelevant in a future with clean distributed energy. A 2019 report by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, a research arm of the Department of Energy, found that greater use of rooftop solar can reduce the need for new transmission lines, displace expensive power plants, and save the energy that is lost when electricity is moved long distance. There needs to be more focus on transitioning the local clean energy sector to be able to provide high quality union jobs. For solar, this could be done by developing mid-sized projects on large rooftops and parking lots close to or in population centers and aggregating them to provide sufficient economies of scale for project labor agreements to be developed. Next slide, please. Sorry about that. This slide describes two issues in the electric sector: a commitment to hydrogen, renewable natural gas, and gas plants. Those resources are not compatible with our climate and EJ requirements. The scoping plan draft reads, Hydrogen and renewable natural gas must remain options as we transition away from fossil fuels. This is on page 156 and 157. And secondly, in the near term, fossil fuels generation will continue to play a critical role in grid reliability until other clean, dispatchable alternatives are available and can be deployed. This is on page 158 of the draft. From the EJAC's expert perspective, these are not the right solutions for the electricity sectors. Producing and using gray and blue hydrogen produces more GHG emissions than burning fossil fuels. Renewable natural gas harms Central Valley communities and the environment. There are better ways to strengthen grid reliability and energy resilience, including investing in diverse renewable resources like geothermal and offshore wind, in addition to making big investments in distributed energy resources. This means investing in energy conservation, energy efficiency, demand response, and local community scale solar and wind tied to microgrids. These local resources would strengthen grid reliability and resilience to wildfires and significantly reduce the need for public safety power shutoffs, which reduces grid reliability. The last thing we need at this stage is to be investing in new polluting resources, particularly fossil fuels. Next slide, please. All right. And yet the draft scoping plan specifically includes adding 10 gigawatts of new gas plant capacity in addition to maintaining the existing gas fleet. New fossil fuel infrastructure runs completely counter to the purpose of this scoping plan, in addition to frustrating the purpose of SB 100. The scoping plan should specifically exclude any new gas infrastructure. Keeping fossil fuel and combustion generation on the electric system guarantees disproportionate impacts on low-income communities and communities of color, such as in the LA and Central Valley areas where power plants are already located and where air quality is the worst in the nation. Planning for 10 additional gigawatts of fossil fuel generation, whether for reliability or ancillary services or energy, exacerbates this injustice. This is already clear based on where gas plants are currently located. Next slide, please. What does this mean for EJ communities? This chart shows that California's most polluting power plants are already disproportionately located in disadvantaged communities. Without a lower electric sector emissions target or specific protections, new gas plant capacity is likely to harm EJ communities further. It is much harder to permit entirely new gas plants than it is to expand existing plants, and the PUC recently ordered new procurement at existing plants. This means that if modeling shows the need for new gas capacity, it will likely come in the form of expansion to existing plants. Since gas plants are disproportionately sited in disadvantaged communities and communities of color, this means expansion to existing gas plants will increase emissions at the same gas plants that already poison these communities. There is a better way forward. Next slide, please. 100% clean, reliable energy grid is feasible. There are multiple reports to say this. A very recent report by Energy Innovation and Grid Lab showed that we can reach a fully reliable 85% clean energy grid by 2030 without any new gas infrastructure, even under high electrification scenarios. The SB 100 study showed that a clean, reliable grid was possible even under a no combustion scenario. A clean, renewable grid can meet reliability standards, particularly if you have a diverse mix of renewables. The Energy Innovation Report also showed that investing in geothermal and offshore wind, even in small amounts, can significantly decrease the amount of solar needed and lower dependence on imports and in-state gas. Additionally, we cannot be talking about the infeasibility and renewability in renewable build out when the draft plan considers building out massive amounts of unproven CCS and direct air capture technology, which has not been deployed at the utility scale. The draft plan is clear that it doesn't include the renewable resources that carbon capture and removal technology would require. It is far more feasible to build diverse renewables than it is to build gas infrastructure, carbon dioxide removal technology, and the renewables needed to power them. Furthermore, it is the CEC, PUC, and CAISO who have the authority, tools, and the targeted expertise to ensure that the lights stay on. This isn't CARB's responsibility. Rather, CARB's responsibility is to chart a course for the medium and long term, not to focus on short-term constraints. And just, I guess, for source, this image is from the Achieving 85% clean electricity by 2030 in California Energy Innovation Policy and Technology Report. Next slide, please. In summary, these are the real changes that are needed for the electric sector portion of the scoping plan. In order to adopt real zero scenario goals, this would include reducing the electric sector emissions target to 0 million metric tons of greenhouse gases by 2035. It would include no new gas capacity, meaning no new gas build and no expansion of existing gas plants. It would require all resource generation to be 100% renewable portfolio standard eligible and zero carbon, and zero carbon emissions. Scale up peak shaving measures, meaning more energy conservation, energy efficiency, and demand response measures. This scenario also would include no carbon dioxide removal or carbon capture measures in the electric sector, instead avoiding direct emission from the electric sector altogether, as well as to begin the phase out of gas power plants immediately, starting in EJ communities and disadvantaged communities. In order to amend modeling to meet real zero scenario goals, CARB would need to model realistic increases in availability of behind the meter storage, vehicle to grid technologies, and demand side programs that have been approved by the PUC. Appropriately model the cost of renewable energy versus gas-fired generation and CCS CDR required to meet neutrality. Include line losses in retail sales interpretation of SB 100, model aggregate health impacts from 2022 to 2045, and social costs of co-pollutants on disadvantaged communities. The draft scoping plan's public health impacts analysis included only snapshots of health benefits rather than a more comprehensive analysis. Instead, CARB needs to model the overall health impacts and costs or savings for each of the alternatives before determining that the proposed scenario is really the least cost option for electricity. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm gonna talk briefly about public health and economic modeling. So, I'm saying a lot. We need transparency around specific modeling inputs in order to have robust public analysis. Economic modeling has been too narrow of a tool to achieve our goals. Current projections about labor and employment are limited to production-oriented industries, particularly the extractive fossil fuel-based incumbent economy. We need a just transition plan with a more comprehensive analysis of labor and employment sectors beyond production jobs. CARB claims that the proposed scenario has the least declining effect on employment and economic growth of all the scenarios considered. However, the in-plan economic models uses the category employment based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Bureau of Economic Analysis. This category, in turn, comes from the North American Industry Classification System, NICE Industry Classification System, which is a production-oriented economic concept. CARB is focused on preserving the incumbent economy. In addition to the projected employment in clean energy sectors, we need to think beyond production. Modeling must demonstrate the effects on labor and employment in the regenerative and renewable energy sectors and assess the impact on social infrastructure. For example, employment data for community health workers, green jobs training, and education. Implementing a community-driven real zero alternative will need a more robust social infrastructure that doesn't rely on the state's meager implementation grants. Therefore, we need to include the creation of reproductive and regenerative jobs, including education, care work, coordination, oversight, and maintenance in the modeling projections for the real zero alternative. The scoping plan does not model the health and economic impacts over the same time period. This needs to happen for an accurate analysis and to enable an apples to apples comparison. Finally, we would like to know CARB's estimate of the total aggregate cost of scenario 3 implementation. Next slide, please. The purpose of this slide is to share how the proposed scenario alternative results in roughly $1.5 billion less in community health benefits than alternative 1, especially because public health has been touted by the proposed scenario as one of the major benefits of this plan, when from the graph, you can see that that's not the case. Next slide, please. It's over to Martha.
Thank you. So one of the things that is embedded in the scoping plan and in many ways in our very own economy and one of the appendices is that this new economy, electric vehicles, this electrification does come with trade-offs, and it will mean an increase in lithium extraction because it's ubiquitous in our batteries and our phones and laptops and certainly electric vehicles. And so we're deeply concerned that that we aren't doing the kind of life cycle assessment and the kind of deep community engagement that I talked about earlier. We know that the extraction of lithium, whether it's the brine, and will leach chemicals and contaminate water, takes water allotments from tribes and farmers and general population, displaces local communities and indigenous people. Next slide. So it's expanding here, as we know, and we know that we're going to need to make sure that communities have a seat at the table. It's something that Luis Olmedo, who is from the community and is part of this lithium committee, is been really talking about the need to shape the policies, ensure that communities are not left behind. We can't stress enough, and I don't know that we know how to do it as an agency, is this idea of informed prior consent, the power to shape the policies on lithium extraction, and how we balance benefits and burdens for communities. Lithium extracted beyond California for California's EV exports also creates EJ sacrifice zones in indigenous communities in the Southwest, in the US, and the global South. And we're often told that our environmental protections are better, and so we should do it here. I'm reminded of a tour we did of the Los Angeles oil fields for people from the DRC and from Ecuador and other places, and they were like, when I think of LA, this is not what I think about. They don't do this in our countries. I can't believe they're doing it in Los Angeles. So I think we need to balance those trade-offs. Just saying that, oh, the people over there, those others, don't regulate as well as ours, I think is a misnomer. And you can ask many of the people in this audience who live on the front lines of production if that's true or not. So next slide. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Jill Wynot with our, who is also a member of the EJAC, to talk about natural and working lands. I want bleach right now.
Thank you. Hey, young Choyahwet Jill Sherman Warren, Natinahwe Natanuk, Jane and his son. My name is Jill Sherman Warren, and I'm a member of the EJAC, and I'm an enrolled member of the Hoopa tribe. And I use the term enrolled member on purpose because what that means is I am a dual citizen of the United States. I'm a citizen of my tribe, and I'm a citizen of the U.S. And enrollment status is really important because that's what gives me special status in terms of I'm not just an ethnic minority. I am an enrolled member of a tribe that has a special relationship with the state and with the federal government. And I'm here to talk about, well, I guess mostly I should say that I'm disappointed. I was just recently appointed to the EJAC, and even though since the inception of the EJAC was supposed to have a tribal representative, this is the first time in 2022 that the EJAC does have well, I wanted to say elected official. I have just won my election, so I'm also an elected official of my tribe. And I'm here to say that this plan has done little to nothing to engage tribes. And I don't blame your staff. I blame it on the fact that like other agencies within the state, they don't know how to work with tribes. And quite frankly, I don't know that they've ever asked a tribe, how do you want us to work with you? There are actually several tribes who have a tribal consultation policy. How that is delivered to the agency, I don't know. But you will be receiving one from the Hoopa tribe shortly. So we do have our own aspects of how you consult with us. There are 109 federally recognized tribes in the state of California. And unfortunately, you probably can't name 10 of them. There's an additional 40 tribes that are seeking recognition in the state of California. Through no fault of their own, they have not been able to be federally recognized. Anyone can say, oh, I'm a member of this tribe or that tribe, and claim ethnicity of being a tribe, but being an enrolled member has a special status. We don't know fully what the impacts are on tribal lands within the scoping plan because the scoping plan didn't do anything to engage tribes. And in fact, I find it disingenuous that the scoping plan itself only mentions tribes about 6 times. 6 times in a 280-page document. When we know that the federal lands in the state of California encompass about 48 million acres. So that's a lot of acreage within the state of California that the state will have to think about how they're going to involve them in your scoping plan, which hasn't been done. Additionally, there is an executive order that was done by Jerry Brown, B1011, and that says that the state agencies are required to give government-to-government consultation with tribes, and they're to work with the Tribal Advisor's Office. There's additionally Newsom's executive order, N1519, which also reiterates the same thing, that engagement with tribes must be done on a government-to-government level. And that means that, Ms. Randolph, you would probably be the official that would provide a letter to the tribes to say, here's our draft scoping plan, and here's how it might impact you and why we need your input. Instead, tribes are typically reduced to providing public comment in a public comment forum, which is, in my opinion, inappropriate. The scoping plan does mention that there was tribal input received. It's disingenuous, in my opinion, to say that tribal input was received because they do notate a June meeting of 2021. I was hard-pressed to find any formal comment provided by a tribe on an input of this plan. It's very disappointing. And again, I don't blame your staff and I don't necessarily blame the agency, but quite frankly, you simply don't know how to work with tribes. I came here today wearing the cap. This is my sister's. This was made by my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and it was made for my grandmother, so this cap is quite old. And it takes over a year to gather all of the materials needed to make this cap. This cap, by any standard, is historical and timeless. And when I wear this cap and I wear my necklaces, I feel like my ancestors are with me, my grandmothers are with me. I hope that I do them proud, and in the sense that I still feel like we're fighting for our rights, we're fighting to be recognized. And so I implore upon you that with the EJAC recommendations, the information that we give you in accordance to tribes is really important, but I do need to see that there is more engagement with tribes on a government-to-government basis. What I would like to know is how CARB plans to follow the law, meaning the executive orders that are in place to engage tribes. And I would be happy to work with anyone directly to ensure that that engagement happens with the 109 federally recognized tribes that exist within California. I'm also the executive director of the Native American Environmental Protection Coalition, and I work with 28 tribes directly within the state, up and down the state. Next slide, please. I'm really proud to show these pictures. That's me fishing because I still engage in traditional subsistence fishing. It's an important food item to our people. And that is my son. He has a traditional drum. We're one of the unique tribes. The Hoopa tribe is a unique tribe in the sense that we have a square drum. His drum is made with a harbor seal that he captured by accident. And rather than let the carcass lay there as tradition demands, we use everything we catch. We eat everything we kill. And we do that with prayers and honoring that the animal has given its life to us. And the same way with all of our regalia, when an animal gives their life up to us, we extend that life spiritually by making it into our precious regalia items. That is, he's holding a sturgeon that lives in our rivers, and a sturgeon has to live for 15 years before it even becomes able to reproduce. So the larger the sturgeon, the older it is. The other picture on the bottom is of our experience with wildfire. Our tribes that are located in rural areas, often the impacts from wildfire are not necessarily by fire itself, but by smoke. We had 7 HEPA filters in our house running 24/7 because of the wildfire that wasn't on our land, but was about 12 miles away. My father had to be taken to the emergency room because he thought he was having a heart attack, when in fact it was just the smoke was so bad. We have to live with wildfires. We also have to live with utility outages. We have to, I have lived in San Diego, and I can tell you that living in the urban environment of San Diego, I never experienced a brownout or a power out, only that one time when somebody flipped the switch and everybody went crazy. But when you live in a rural area within California, because our utilities are often isolated, we go without power for days. And as a result of that, I'm embarrassed to say that because we have medical equipment that needs to be operated and used by my father, we have to power up the old diesel generator. We have a very large diesel generator. And that's where we're at. My tribe received a grant to put in 8 charging stations about 2 years ago. They were put in, finished by June of last year. Guess what? There's no power to them. There's no power to those utilities because they have to replace 2 transformers in order to power up the chargers. And those are the issues that we're facing within rural environments, that the utility is not there yet. So this draft plan, I know I'm getting a little off topic, but unless you involve the utilities and require the utilities to actually do something with their outdated electrical lines, we're never going to reach our goals for 2045. That's reality. And again, I hope that someday the 8 chargers that were paid for by CARB will actually be electrified, maybe next year. So that'll be a 3-year project, but they're fully built and they're being vandalized because what are they doing? They're just sitting there doing nothing, not being used at all. So when we think about tribes, we also, and the EJAC recommendations specifically to natural working lands, we do need to think about non-traditional technical input, tribal input, including traditional ecological knowledge, such as cultural burning. We still need to burn many of our plants for basketry, foods, and medicines. That's a natural part of our ways of managing the lands. And we have to think about the fact that we need free and prior and informed consent. As you know, that comes from the United Nations Declaration. Next slide, please. We need a real zero alternative included in the recommendations. And we need to include an ambitious pesticide reduction target. We need to reduce synthetic pesticides by 50% by 2030. We need to reduce hazardous pesticides by 75% by 2030. And I'm proud to say that many of the tribes engaged in commercial agriculture within the state of California, guess what? We've already gone organic. And we go organic because we know that what we're doing today is not for ourselves today, but for 7 generations ahead. I didn't decide to become an elected official of my tribe because it's something that I wanted to do for me. It's something that I wanted to do for the future generations that are coming. I'm 56 years old. The next generation that's going to lead my tribe into the future has yet to come, and they will be coming. So when we think about this, we also need to think about our future generations. We need to start with organic phosphates, fumigants, paraquats, and neonicotinoids. I might not be saying that right. We need to include organic farming in all scoping plan scenarios. We need to restructure scenarios to model progressive percentage increases in the adoption of all proposed agricultural management strategies. Organic agriculture should make up 30% of the total agricultural acreage by 2030, or by 80% by 2045. And agriculture is something that's near and dear to me because guess what? The river, the Trinity River, which is one of the last wild and scenic rivers within the state of California, has its water taken by about 80% of our water is taken to feed the Sacramento River and act as a cooling agent so that it could be cool water that's given to the Central Valley. Tribes are impacted over and over. And in the recommendations, especially in Bakersfield, when you're looking at injecting carbon into underground wells, or we're not even thinking about how it may impact the local tribes there. So again, I look forward to working with you to provide meaningful engagement with the tribes in government-to-government consultation on this scoping plan. Thank you.
And I know I'm standing between you and many of the communities who came to give public testimony. So I know that this was a lot, and I wanted you to breathe for a moment before I finish so that you would listen to me, but I'm also really concerned about the time and making sure that we have time for community participation. So really in closing, and I think you have much of the information on my slides, but I do want to loop back to some of our key asks. Plan for a full coordinated phase out of fossil fuels by 2045, end oil extraction by 2035, phase out oil refining by 2045, and transition to clean, renewable, zero emission electricity by 2035. Accelerate the scale up and investments in clean cars, trucks, and mass transit while addressing the trade-offs such as lithium extraction. And rev up transit for working class California's mass transit and unique transit opportunities like the Raitero programs, minimize reliance on climate policy dead ends like carbon capture and storage that extends the life of the state's otherwise defunct fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to do this quickly, and again, thank you for all the work. Thank you to the CARB staff, to the board, to Trish and to Chanel, who's worked with us and have been patient with us, and to all the community folks who came up who've also been patient with us. I do want to call, you have the slides. This proposed scenario is not on the right path. We've provided you with a real zero alternative path, and we hope that this time is the charm, where we actually work together to get to a real zero, where we're actually working in partnership. So thank you very much.
All right.